Another incredibly powerful feature in Blender is using nodes for your lights. And I just have the default area light and a big ass plane in here so, we can visualize what's going on. This area light here is what we're going to use. And honestly, it's the only one that really works with this feature anyways, if you want to get the results that I'm trying to show in this video. So over here, it should say something like use nodes. If it doesn't, please make sure you're using cycles because in Eevee this doesn't work. But inside of cycles, click on use nodes and it should enable you to start using nodes. Now I'm just going to open up a shader workspace here. And at this point, with our light selected, we should see something called an emission node and a light output node. These are the shader nodes for our lamp. We can control the color here. We can control the strength here. But honestly, I would not do that. I would control color through the original interface on the right side here and the strength as well. Just a little bit more flexible and you don't need to mess with these values here. We can use nodes to control this emission here. Now, how does that work, would you say? Well, essentially, it's very similar to if we were to take a plane, we were to put it up here and we could take like a node and, take a noise texture. Let's take a color ramp and let's plug that into the alpha. And if we now do something like this, maybe something like this, and we start to basically decreasing our spread here, you can sort of see it going on here, right? As you can see, the shadows that this creates are based on this sort of shape that we're putting in front of our light here. The cool thing with the use nodes is that we basically can skip this step and do it all inside of our lamp. That seems kind of magical, but we actually can do that. So if we take a noise texture and we take a color ramp again, and we plug this into the color of our emission, there we go. We dial this in and we dial that in. We created something very similar, but it's not showing up. And that's because the spread of our area light is basically too big. And if we start decreasing our beam shape here, especially to something very small like 0. Basically, we have the exact same sort of texture that we just had, right? And we can take this, maybe make the spread a little bit bigger. And what we can do in this method is we can create all kinds of interesting shapes and we can just simply scale up our area light with the size slider here. And in this way, we can do all matter of cool effects. And you can also animate this, you could, change the distortion, get some cool effects going, basically create some sort of light cookie or gobo effect, which is basically shadow patterns, which will make your final render look that much more interesting. For example, simply animating something like this would look very similar to light shining through leaves, for example. So that's a very cool effect that you can get going in, just a couple of seconds with this setup. All of this works by default with area lights. So honestly, area lights are the way to go. But in the case you do want a different light to function, like for example, a spot lamp, you can see it doesn't work anymore, but you can fix this by adding in a texture coordinate node and taking the normal, there we go, and plugging that into the vector for the noise texture. You just got to make sure you set the radius down to 0, and there we have it. You now get control over this effect as well. Very similar to the area light, but just a little bit different compared to actual area light by using the normal there. Same with like a point light, you can do the same. Again, make sure to use texture coordinates and then use the normal coordinates for the vector input for the noise texture to get this to work. But again, by default, it works with area lights. And honestly, I always use area lights myself. Now, additionally, what you could do is you could use an image texture, for example, and plug that into the emission, open up, well, basically any image that you want. I'm just going to go and use one of the footage pieces for this course. For example, let's take this one. And as you can see, we now get basically the video as sort of a light. Now, we could use cyclic here and we could say this has 5,000 frames, for example. And at this point, it would play as a video as well. So we actually can create animated lights. Now, this doesn't do much, this footage that I used, but I'm going to use this one, for example. And again, if we just set our frame rate here and auto refresh, sorry, there we go. We now have an animated light. The light is changing based on the footage input, which is a really, really powerful tool and actually a great way to create some sort of projector, right? So especially if we now take our world shader and we add a volume like we did in the lessons before here, and we set the density to be very, very low. At this point, we get a pretty cool spotlight effect here, which kind of looks like a projector, and you can see the colors coming through the light here as well. I think that's really, really cool. Now, another effect that we can create using this method is something called IES lighting. Now, IES lighting is basically using IES textures to generate lamp shapes. If you now Google IES texture, you should see a website pop up called the IES library. Now, this contains a bunch of light shapes, which you can all download for free. It might take a while to load because there's like 500,000 of them, but you can just generate any of these lights that you see here based on these textures. So if, for example, we take this one here, we can just download the IES file, and inside of Blender, we can now add an IES texture, set the factor there as the strength, and not as the color, but as the strength. Use the external feature here and open up the IES texture that we just downloaded. I believe it's this one. All right, so this works best when not using an area light, but using a point light instead, because, you know, in the actual real world, most lights are point lights, and these are resemblant of actual lamps inside of the real world, like light fittings, for example. And you can see that the cookie that we just sort of saw on the website there is now inside of Blender. And these IES textures are a great way to add realism to indoor lighting, architectural visualizations, and any type of lighting where you want to use actual real world lighting situations and create natural light patterns based on actual existing lamps. Make sure to look into that and start using IES lights for more realistic lighting as well. Now, these are some ways to use nodes with lights inside of Blender, and you can get completely creative with this and do any host of effects using this method. So go ahead, get creative, and start using nodes for your lights in cycles. That wraps up this lesson, and in the next lesson, we're going to talk about reducing noise as part of your lighting.